We are now up to part 4 in the life of Disney artist Herb Ryman. In the middle of the week, I've been posting some seasonal favorites to round out our current offerings. But on Sunday, we're moving through the life of Ryman, an artist central to the development of Disney films in the 1940s and, more significantly, to Walt's Park in the mid-1950s. The first stretch of episodes here on the podcast examines his early life and career, his experiences working on live-action films at MGM, and his travel. But these will be key ingredients that Walt will rely on to create Disneyland. These are experiences beyond that of most longtime artists who work for the Disney studio. There are a few animation artists, such as Claude Coates and Ken Anderson, both of whom were friends of Ryman, who had experience with live-action set design, but of those artists associated with Disney, no one else would have the depth and breadth of experience with these tools as Herb Ryman. These experiences, plus Ryman's later work with Disney films, would give him the right set of skills to help translate Walt's vision for a park into buildable designs. But today, as we start out this 4th episode, Herb Ryman is growing weary of his work at MGM as he feels it takes too much time and effort away from his real ambition, which in the mid-1930s was to become an artist whose watercolors and sketches were featured in galleries and museums across the country. So, if you're ready, here we go. By the mid-1930s, Ryman understood his limitations at MGM. "I was working 12 to 20 hours a day," he said, 7 days a week sometimes. He was well-liked and his work was well-respected, but with the reorganization of the studio in 1933, while Ryman was still proving himself, other artists had been promoted or hired into roles as assistant art directors to accommodate the multiple production teams. As a result, Ryman understood that his opportunities for true advancement were limited, but he could see that there were advantages to working at MGM beyond the money. Though his own drawings and paintings were rarely seen on screen, they were used to develop the production, from scene layout to set construction. He worked on films that were viewed around the world. And though he was an invisible, unnamed artist, his efforts, anonymous as they were seen by millions each year. On many productions, he had befriended international stars such as Jean Harlow and Greta Garbo, giving him a type of secondhand celebrity he never could have imagined as a boy. But most of all, he was surrounded by others who appreciated and understood the intricacies of good art. At the top of this list was Cedric Gibbons. Ryman's relationship with Gibbons was in ways an extension of past relationships he had enjoyed with older male mentors such as Professor Robb. Gibbons wasn't quite old enough to be a stand-in father. He was 17 years older than Ryman, nowhere near as old as Ryman's actual father, who had been 32 years older than Herbie. Gibbons existed more likely as a kindly uncle, but someone to whom Ryman felt a deep loyalty. And in return, Ryman imagined that Gibbons needed him as an artist as well. The young man who had sketched up designs and continuity drawings for dozens and dozens of films, often staying in his office long after other artists had gone home. Ryman liked the family-like closeness of the studio, also the way that so many of their efforts were focused on art. Yet, despite his fondness for MGM and the people there, Ryman was growing frustrated as he now worked such long hours that he had little time for his own art. At times, he didn't even have the opportunity to cash his checks, allowing a small stack to accumulate in his wallet. He could see with clarity 2 visions of himself: the quietly respected sketch artist he had become, and the man who perhaps had the ability to have his watercolors admired by the art world, with his name signed neatly in the lower right corner of each painting. This was the burden of art school, all those classes that reinforced the idea that personal success was primarily defined by an artist's own vision, not how successfully he lifted the vision of another artist onto the screen. A voice deep inside reminded him that though he was finding success at a movie studio, he was doing nothing of substance to claim the dream he had embraced so deeply those 3 years he had lived in Chicago. These concerns came to a head in 1934 and 1935 as he worked on Mutiny on the Bounty, another Thalberg costume drama complete with elaborate sets, effect shots, and big stars, including Clark Gable and Charles Laughton. Ryman created sketches that defined the sets on the ship and in Tahiti. Others in the department created highly detailed miniatures of the HMS Bounty, and still others created a short section of animation very different than the type of animation produced at Disney, a red line moving around a world map to show the progress of the Bounty as it sailed from England to Tahiti. As had been the case for years, Ryman's work was mostly focused on pre-production. Around the time actors showed up, he moved on to the next film. As filming progressed on the MGM lot and on the California coast with Mutiny, Ryman focused on the next Thalberg production, The Good Earth. The Good Earth was the story of a peasant wheat farmer in China who, after the 1911 revolution, rises through misfortune toward prosperity. Though Thalberg had sent a second unit team to China to film establishing shots and material that could be used for background plates, he did not send members of the art department. Ryman was expected to use footage captured by the second unit team, as well as various photographs to guide his work in developing sets. These sets included a peasant's house, the homes of two lords, a village for refugees, and streets and markets in an unnamed southern city. As for those wheat fields and the farm village, those would be developed on a large piece of land over in the San Fernando Valley, once some telephone poles and other markers of contemporary America were removed. For weeks, Ryman worked on sketches for The Good Earth. As he did from his second-story office, he saw the stars of Mutiny not far from his window, sunbathing on the roof, Clark Gable, Charles Laughton, and Donald Crisp. As this was winter, they were doing their best to tan so they would be more convincing in their roles as British naval officers. Over time, Donald Crisp, a British actor, more than the others took an interest in Ryman and his work. I was a young kid, Ryman said, and they'd come up and see my work, so we became kind of close. Crisp, Ryman learned, had a good understanding of film production, as he'd worked not only as an actor but for years as a director. One afternoon, while in the art department, he said, "You're working awfully hard, kid." Ryman admitted that he was. Crisp then looked around the room, noticing how Ryman created his work. Around his desk were photos of villages and fields in China, at least some of which had been taken by that second unit team. Crisp put the situation together quickly. The photos were field studies whose details Ryman worked into his sketches. "What background do you have for travel?" he said. "I got it from research and the library." Crisp asked if Ryman had visited China with the second unit team. "No," Ryman answered. "I didn't get to go anywhere." But he also understood the larger question. How deeply did Ryman understand the locales he recreated for the screen? "I'm living in an artificial world," he admitted. "So am I," Crisp added, stepping to the other side of the room to examine another reference photo. "How old are you?" "I'm 25. Crisp nodded as though he understood something essential about Ryman. "Why don't you take a trip? Why don't you go over to Tucson or Phoenix? Have you seen any of the world?" "No, I haven't seen any of the world at all. I've seen Chicago and Decatur, Illinois, and Vernon and Mount Pulaski and Culver City, and that's all." Crisp gestured to the present drawing on the desk. "You're too young to spend your life doing this slave labor." "Yes, I know that," Ryman said. "You should see the world. Especially an artist or a writer or a musician or an actor should see the world, should understand the world." "But you expect me to give up a job when no one can get a job. I'll never get another job if I give this job up." "You have talent," Crisp said. Then he added, "I think you have good health." He picked up another drawing, then he let it fall back softly onto the table. "Before you get married, before you handicap yourself with children and a family, Then he simply ended his sentence, as though the rest of his thought was obvious. Chris began to walk away, shrugging his shoulders, and said, "I'm just telling you what I think." Ryman sat there, surrounded by photos of ox carts, village markets, and wheat fields, knowing that what Chris had told him was true. Moreover, it was clear now that the secrets of his heart were as visible to others, even casual acquaintances, as they were to himself. Strangers apparently could look at a young artist like Claude Coates and know that he'd seen the world. Those same strangers could also look at Ryman and know that he'd seen very little of it. Ryman understood where he had gone wrong. As a new graduate, he had needed money. He'd needed to save himself from the gray desperation that was coming down around him. Each night, as he traveled from the MGM lot to his apartment in Culver City, he saw people waiting in soup lines, all of them anxious to find work. But Ryman had money, thousands of dollars in the bank. Still, he sensed the difficulties of his current position. For years, he had exchanged his desire to become an artist for the security of his job and a regular paycheck. That night, as he left the art department, Ryman felt something new well up inside of himself, a feeling he'd previously sensed, but never with this level of conviction. He was tired of looking at artificial scenery, sets, and facades built simply so they would look good on screen. He also felt like somewhat of a fraud. He was recreating buildings and environments that he had never experienced himself. He knew the world only through photography books and National Geographic. He sensed an emptiness here, one that was new. It was all artificial, he said. But that wasn't the exact problem, not the one that most bothered him. Rather, it was that his version of the world was artificial. It was built only on what others had seen. In these feelings, Ryman was confronting his personal understanding of art. He wanted to express something real about the world, a sense of place, based on his own experiences. That he had experienced a place was the basis for truth in art. What he was doing now, what he had been doing for years, was hoping to learn just enough about a place to create sketches that would hold a secondhand sense of reality on screen, sketches that were also configured to artfully express a mood. But there was very little of himself, of his own experiences, of a personal truth up there on that screen. In all likelihood, he would have let his conscience grind away at him for weeks. But that night, returning to his apartment in Culver City, he found a letter from his cousin, Halvern Norris, who served as the American vice consul in Bangkok. The letter was thin, written on especially light paper intended for airmail delivery. It was dated February 15th, 1935, but it had taken weeks to arrive in California. Herbie unfolded the pages to find an invitation. "Herbert," the letter began, "if you ever get loose from your obligations there at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, I'd like to have you come out here and visit me. I have entry into Tokyo and Peking and Singapore, Bombay, Calcutta, Kuala Lumpur." He explained that his diplomatic connections would give Herbie access to consulates in Hong Kong, Japan, and China, perhaps access to government officials as well. In the pages that followed, Norris explained that after nearly 5 years in Bangkok, he would soon be transferred to Belgrade, Yugoslavia. This would be Ryman's final opportunity to visit him in Asia. As he examined the letter, Ryman started to believe that Halvern's message delivered on that day was a type of spiritual sign, a confirmation that the universe, for some reason, wanted him to pursue his dream of travel. I interpreted it as meaning that I should move and that I should not be reluctant and I shouldn't grasp and hang on to my job at MGM. All night he thought about it. This, he believed, is what real artists do. They have experiences. This was what his first art teacher had done, George Rabb. He had toured the world before settling down to teach in Decatur. But still, Ryman was unsure. He decided to talk over the matter with Lucille and her fiancé, Louis McClune. "You've got no right to kill yourself for MGM, Herb," McClune said. "You should travel. You've got the money." Ryman admitted that this was what he wanted to do. As McClune was more familiar with travel arrangements, Ryman asked him to buy the ticket. He went to the steamship line, Ryman explained, and he bought a ticket around the world, first class, which cost $867. In 1935, this was a substantial sum of money, more than the average American made in 6 months. Yet it was a ticket that would allow Ryman to sail from country to country, traveling for at least a year, maybe longer. It was an investment in his own future, an opportunity. Not long after, he made an appointment to speak with Cedric Gibbons. For a while now, Ryman believed that MGM was a type of family, and as an extension, its managers, such as Gibbons, should expect certain things from him. If anything, Ryman had learned that family relationships, important as they were, often came with expectations that needed to be negotiated. For example, his mother had wanted him to be a doctor, a prospect that could only be negotiated once he was deathly ill. Ryman believed that Gibbons expected him to be loyal, to forever pencil out a stack of sketches for the next big film. For this reason, Ryman believed that Gibbons would react with anger. Once in the office, Ryman looked across the table at his boss. Gibbons was a slender man with neatly trimmed hair combed back from his forehead and a pencil-thin mustache. His dark eyes, arranged beneath bushy eyebrows, made it seem he could see into a person's soul. Ryman held his breath for a moment before he explained both his gratitude for his job with MGM, but also his frustration at being trapped in Los Angeles. Instead of anger, to Ryman's surprise, the great art director expressed understanding. Once Ryman had described his plan to see the world, to improve his art, Gibbons asked, "Where'd you get the money?" Ryman explained that he'd saved up 3 months' worth of his wages. He'd simply been too busy to cash and spend the checks. "How long are you going to be gone?" 2 years, Ryman said. "Well, that's wonderful. I wish I could have done that at your age, and I want to tell you that whenever you come back, you will always have a job here." Gibbons offered a reserved smile that to Ryman appeared genuine. "I can make you the greatest art director in the motion picture business." He glanced briefly out the window. "I wish you would learn a little bit more about architecture, but that's up to you." "Well, Mr. Gibbons," Ryman said, "I thank you very much, but I want to be an artist, and I'm set to be an artist, and I've been here as a convenience to make a living." Gibbons looked at Ryman, as though he could see more than one possible outcome for this trip he intended to take. "Well, be sure to come back." In the weeks that followed, Ryman felt the coming change, something he hoped would come down around him with force, moving him from a commercial artist to an artist focused on his own vision. Around Hollywood, he let it be known early in the year that he would travel around the world. He mentioned that he was young and that he intended to travel as long as his money lasted, hoping that someone might eventually act as his patron. This was another thing he had learned in art school, that patrons often came from unlikely places. At the studio, a congenial mood continued to exist between Ryman and Gibbons as he finished work on The Good Earth. Once his sketches were done and the film moved into production, Ryman packed up his office and prepared to leave. His friends arranged a send-off party at a beach club in Santa Monica. Popular with studio artists, the beach club was situated near the pier at the end of the sand. And like many backlot buildings, the club itself resembled a Gothic castle with a cut stone exterior and high-ceilinged dining, bar, and lounge areas. Among the attendees was Cedric Gibbons, who again reminded Herbie that with a little additional study, particularly in architecture, he was good enough to rise from his current position of sketch artist and eventually take on the role of art director. But Ryman believed, or at least hoped, that his life was about to move in a different direction. At the end of 1935, Herb Ryman wasn't the only person in Los Angeles on the verge of a transformation. On the other side of Hollywood, out in the Silver Lake district, artists at the small Disney studio were working on a transformation of their own. Similar to MGM, artists at Disney gathered regularly on a soundstage to improve their life-drawing skills, sketching models positioned on a podium. But unlike MGM, the Disney drawing classes were not only paid for by the studio, but were done on company time. Moreover, Disney animators were joined by an art instructor who critiqued their drawings and offered suggestions for improvement. For the past 2 years, Walt Disney had been hiring classically trained artists, many with art school credentials, to improve the visual quality of his animation. On the soundstage, recently hired art school grads sat side by side with the type of self-trained artists that Disney had hired in the 1920s and early 1930s. But now the studio was moving in a new direction, arranging its efforts to create their first animated feature, a film with realistically drawn human characters, something that would elevate animation from the comedic and musical outings that occupied the studio when Herb Ryman first moved to California, to a presentation that felt far more like art. Ryman stayed in California through the Christmas holidays, largely to be with family and to set up his travels. He took half of his money with him in the form of traveler's checks, and then added Lucille to his account so she could wire him money as he needed it. For a while, he held out hope that established screenwriter Ben H. might offer support for his trip. 2 years earlier, they'd worked on Queen Christina at MGM. Like Herbie, H. had spent his teenage and young adult years in Chicago, where he'd worked as a reporter, though he was now one of the best-known and highest-earning writers in Hollywood, having beaten Charlie Chaplin for the first Academy Award given to a writer. But as his departure date approached, it became clear that H. likely wasn't interested, which meant that Ryman would fund his trip on his own. On Wednesday, January 15th, Ryman was driven to San Pedro. He packed supplies for sketching, watercolor, oils, and photography, the photos he planned to use once he returned home to remind him of details he had seen overseas, as he intended to continue painting after he returned. He said goodbye to family and then boarded the MS Canada, an East Asiatic Danish ship ready to begin his journey. It was primarily a cargo ship with portions arranged for 80 paying customers who traveled on its upper decks. Ryman saw that his things were placed into a cabin he shared with another traveler, and then, mid-morning, he walked out on the deck as the ship made its way to the outer harbor and then to the open ocean, bringing Ryman to a place finally beyond the United States. The ship followed the coast of California and then the coast of Mexico. It passed through the Panama Canal. It stopped briefly in Haiti and Jamaica. While on an excursion in Montego Bay, Ryman sketched and later painted a parish church, a one-story building with a high bell tower surrounded by palm trees and a cemetery. He also sketched and painted the interior of the same building, with a line of pews leading to an empty altar. Both works in their finished forms were watercolor on paper. They were stunning examples of color, perspective, and light, demonstrating Ryman's mastery at the age of 26 of highly realized landscapes with color unifying each composition. The style of these works, however, as with many of Ryman's paintings from this period, were based on urban realism. Like the works of the American ashcan artists of the early 20th century, Ryman's work largely sought to preserve landscapes and situations he experienced firsthand with visual honesty. This style of drawing and painting was exactly what had been valued at MGM, art that inspired the construction of believable sets. But this style of painting, as opposed to art that explored the beauty of human perception or art that experimented with visual play, was more closely tied to artists who preceded Ryman, rather than those such as Picasso and Matisse, who defined art trends in the 1930s. This style was almost surely what attracted Ryman to art as a first-year college student in the late 1920s, and was essential to how he understood his visual relationship with the world around him. His paintings beautified a scene through the use of color and the arrangement of details, elevating the beauty of the painting above the beauty of the real-world locale. But the guiding impulse in his work was to offer a detailed account of what he had seen on his travels. His excursions in the Caribbean were brief, but they set the artistic tone for the journeys that followed. "A few days after the Caribbean," Ryman wrote, "we made passage across the Atlantic." His initial plan was to spend time in England, France, and Italy, perhaps other locations if they interested him, with his first stop being London. In London, Ryman found that his work at MGM opened a few doors. He had letters of introduction that led to dinner invitations and offers to attend movie premieres. Acquaintances would ask him, "Are you from Hollywood?" To which he would reply, "Yes." Then they would ask, "Do you know Clark Gable or Greta Garbo?" Again, Herbie would explain, "Yes, I've worked with them on these pictures." More often than not, the people he met would ask a question that confused Herbie. "Do you know Walt Disney?" Ryman would admit that he didn't know him, and in fact had never even met him. In ways, London was a familiar city, as he'd sketched its streets at least as they had existed in the mid-1800s, as a string of sets for the movie David Copperfield, two of which still existed at MGM as Copperfield Street and Copperfield Court. This sense of secondhand familiarity was only increased when he went to Paris, another city he had helped arrange for the screen in A Tale of Two Cities. Here, too, he could hold up images he had created for the screen next to the city they were meant to represent. Though his sketches had been highly realistic, imbued with both mood and detail, they also lacked something essential. A sense of personal familiarity with the city, a sense of surety and confidence that only comes from visiting a city in person. On March 6th, he attended the French premiere of Mutiny on the Bounty, one of the last films he had worked on at MGM. The film had premiered the previous year in the United States, but only now, after being dubbed, did it premiere in Paris. At the after-party, he expected that some would ask him about his work on the film. A few people did ask about Hollywood, but he mostly found that his limited ability with foreign languages isolated him. "I don't speak French," he said, "so I'm hopeless." Of those people who did speak English, he found they too were interested in Walt Disney. As before, he explained that he didn't know the man, though he'd seen a few of his cartoons. "They'd look at me," Ryman explained, like, "Well, you're a phony because you're not really from Hollywood, because you would know Walt Disney." As he moved through Paris, he noticed that the topic of Walt Disney came up again. After the third time, he decided to change his strategy to claim that he in fact had met the man, though of course Ryman had worked at MGM while Disney had his own studio many miles away. "I said, yes, I know him very well. He's a good friend of mine." Then I was acceptable. It's kind of ridiculous. I had to say that I knew Walt Disney in order to get by in Paris. Along with this, when he found Parisians who spoke English, he learned that A-list movie stars back home weren't necessarily celebrities in Europe. Clark Gable and Greta Garbo and Jean Harlow and Charles Laughton, Ryman said, were very insignificant people internationally. This was one of the first lessons laid at his feet. Ryman had believed that the culture of Hollywood with its stars existed in large cities around the world. But now he could see that this was only something that those in Hollywood liked to believe about themselves. At least in Paris, Ryman observed, when discussing Hollywood films, the name of Walt Disney was the first name to come to anyone's lips. While in Paris, for the first time in his life, he felt cut off from the culture around him, as he didn't speak French. He stayed at the Hotel Palm Royal in Paris, near art galleries and centers of intellectual life. This was the neighborhood once frequented by painters such as Moreau and Chagall. By selecting this hotel, Ryman saw himself following in their paths. But by 1936, the intellectual centers of Paris, those cafes and bars once filled with people like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, had partially faded away. At times, Ryman withdrew into books, novels mainly. He also wrote letters to family and friends. In this, he could see the obvious contradictions in himself. He both needed to explore the world far from home, and he needed to remain connected to those he had known for years. Likewise, he wanted a social community, yet he was having difficulty developing one, at least while in Paris. At the moment, he was a solo traveler, a man focused on art, a man who struggled to make meaningful connections. A more serious problem, however, concerned money. Less than 3 months into his travels, he realized he was spending more than he had budgeted. He had spent weeks in England and a month in France, acting more as a tourist than a researcher. On April 7th, he wrote his sister, in part to set up a wire transfer. But the safest transfer would be to his cousin in Thailand, a place he wouldn't arrive for many weeks. He also asked Lucille to follow up with Ben H., the screenwriter who Ryman had hoped might partially sponsor his trip. "You camp out on Mr. H. Trail," he wrote, "and get me endowed, so I will not have to go back to the jute mill. I'll give you a finder's fee and we'll settle for cash." At the moment, he realized that he needed to economize. He left his hotel and moved into a low-cost boarding house for performing arts students, most of whom had also traveled to Paris from other countries. There were about 6 or 8 foreign students there, Ryman explained, and we would go out to parties, and we'd go to different social functions, mostly among the French. There were piano students, and there were voice students, and dancers, and writers. In this way, he found a small community, something similar to what he had known in Chicago. But he hadn't yet found deep connections to either the city or to its culture as he had imagined back home. While Herbie stayed in a student boarding house in Paris, back in America, Lucille struggled with money as well. After working on a string of stage plays, none of which did particularly well, she decided to leave the stage and try her luck elsewhere. "I was not interested in anything," she said, "if I could not be the best." Lucille took a new job with Universal Pictures in New York, working as an assistant talent scout for Harry Evans. Their regional office, based in Rockefeller Center, had 3 people: longtime Universal manager Harry Evans, his assistant Dean Markham, and, as the new hire, Lucille. Once in New York, Universal sent her across the states to find memorable faces that would fill the screen with personality. She visited regional theaters, a world that she knew, looking for fresh talent. In May, she visited the University of Kansas, where she offered a screen test to the governor's daughter, then a student at the university, an offer that was turned down. A few days later, she married Louis McClune in a private ceremony in Garnett, Kansas. Their honeymoon, if there was much of one, was short. Lucille was on the road almost immediately after the ceremony was over. Later in the month, she visited the Kilbuck Theater in Pittsburgh, where she selected 2 actors for a screen test. Then she moved on to Atlantic City. She was not necessarily looking for top stars, though she did keep her eye out for that possibility, but rather for memorable faces and pretty girls for supporting roles. Specifically, she was directed to look for men up to the age of 35 and women up to the age of 28. She spent weeks visiting colleges, often reviewing headshots of young women and then talking to a few of them in person. She also attended an endless string of university theater productions. At times, she asked ministers and physicians to fly out for a screen test, explaining, "These persons are generally found to possess the poise, intelligence, and natural demeanor that are essentials of good motion picture acting." In general, she looked for faces that spoke to personality along with beauty. "If we just want a pretty face, there are plenty in Hollywood," she said. For months, she traveled across North America, from Texas to Arizona to Toronto, interviewing screen hopefuls. For the musical, A Young Man's Fancy, she arranged a contest for college-aged women to fill out roles for 15 showgirls. Unlike her experience with acting and directing, she found she excelled at this work. When Dean Markham left the office early the following year, she was promoted to the number 2 position. A few months after that, at least in the trades, she was referred to as a talent exec of Universal. At times, she was able to sit quietly in a theater and examine acting talent on stage, but on other trips, particularly when the media loudly announced her arrival, she found hundreds of people waiting to see her. This was the case when she visited Dallas. As she recalled, at her hotel, she found lines of people who dreamed of Hollywood. "Boys and girls," she said. "Old men and old women, mothers with would-be Shirley Temples, they jammed the lobby." For Lucille, her experience as a talent scout was a good one, an experience that gave her a sense of authority. She was a gatekeeper of Hollywood, a person who decided whose dreams might possibly come true and whose wouldn't. Her new job, though, had one unintended consequence for Herbie. As she was no longer in Los Angeles, she was unable to wire additional funds to him from his Los Angeles-based bank, funds that he needed to continue his tour of Europe. In ways, though, this turned out to be a moot point. While in Paris, he learned that his cousin Halvern might soon leave Thailand, a little earlier than planned, with the previously announced transfer to another consulate. If Ryman wanted diplomatic access to cities in Asia under Halvern's official cover, he should end the European leg of his travels early, bypassing Italy, and begin passage south. From a financial standpoint, this seemed like a good decision for Herbie, as he would be able to replenish its travel funds once he reached Halvern. It would also be a decision that changed his life. By the 1930s, Europe already loomed large in the American imagination. The average American had seen scores of paintings and photos of European cities. But Americans were becoming more curious about Asia, China in particular. And by adjusting his trip, Ryman would extend his time in cities that possibly might hold a greater cultural currency in terms of art once he returned home. I'll be back next Sunday to continue our story of Herb Ryman, a key artist who helped define the look of Disney films and the Disney parks in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and far beyond. I'll also post up in a few days a holiday episode to keep the good feelings here moving forward. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studios and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. You can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 100 episodes not available anywhere else. But the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.